Anyone who may have come into contact with a nurse who has contracted Ebola. Doctors diagnosed the woman with the virus shortly after she visited family and boarded a commercial flight. She's the second healthcare worker to get the virus after treating a Liberian man who died of the disease in Dallas. NHK World's Craig Dale reports.
Nurse Amber Vinson was part of the team caring for Thomas Eric Duncan, the Liberian who developed Ebola last month after arriving in the U.S. Now, 2 days after Duncan died, so last Friday, Vinson took a flight from Dallas, Texas to Cleveland, Ohio to visit family. She flew back on Monday. Now, she did know one of her fellow nurses had contracted Ebola. She also told health authorities that she was suffering from a low-grade fever. Still, they cleared her to fly. Medical teams have transferred Vinson to Atlanta, where she's now in isolation at Emory University Hospital. Health officials have been urging the more than 130 people on her commercial flight to contact the Centers for Disease Control. They're also monitoring her family and tracing her steps in Ohio.
Where she traveled and who she was with.
Vinson was in frequent contact with Thomas Eric Duncan at Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital. He died October 8th. 3 days later, nurse Nina Pham tested positive for the virus. And 3 days after that, doctors diagnosed Vinson with Ebola. They both wore protective gear, so it's not clear how they were exposed.
We're looking at every element of our personal protective equipment and infection control inside the hospitals. We don't have an answer for this right now.
75 other healthcare workers at the hospital are being monitored, along with 48 people who came into contact with Duncan in the community.
It may get worse before it gets better, but it will get better.
It's not getting better, though, in West Africa, where local and foreign medical teams are battling the outbreak. The vast majority of the roughly 9,000 Ebola cases are in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. Nearly half of them have died. Some NGOs are struggling to keep up.
It's quite clear that we are reaching our limit.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has pledged another $40 million to support medical treatment in the affected nations. He's also sending 500,000 sets of protective clothing. U.S. President Barack Obama says more countries need to follow that example.
It is also probably the single most important thing that we can do to prevent a more serious Ebola outbreak in this country is making sure that we get what is a raging epidemic right now in West Africa under control.
Obama has further tightened infectious disease protocols and response at home, but the nation's nurses aren't happy with how this outbreak has been handled.
We've been lied to in terms of the preparation in the hospitals and we know this because the nurses are telling us this, and the nurses are the ones who are caring for the patients.
Still, President Obama says if strict protocols are followed, healthcare workers won't get infected. Now, hospitals here in Japan are also ramping up their vigilance. Experts say the risk of infection is very low for the general public outside of West Africa. Now, the incubation period for Ebola is 2 to 21 days. Initial symptoms include fever, fatigue, and headache, followed by vomiting, diarrhea, and bleeding. It's really how this virus is transmitted, through contact with infected bodily fluids. Now, health officials say the nurse was not vomiting or bleeding on that flight from Cleveland to Dallas. Now, when it comes to treatment, there's no vaccine available right now, although some are in development. Doctors are caring for patients with a variety of drugs, including ones containing antibodies from people who have survived this highly fatal disease. Craig Dale, NHK World.
Now, the U.S.-led military mission fighting the Islamic State militants now has a name. American military leaders have dubbed it Operation Inherent Resolve. They say the name symbolizes the willingness and dedication of coalition members to degrade and destroy the militants. NHK World's Jun Yotsumoto has more.
U.S. military officials say the name is aimed at reflecting the unwavering resolve and the deep commitment of the U.S. and its partner nations. They say they are dedicated to eliminating the terrorist group and the threat it poses to Iraq and Syria. The campaign began in Iraq on August 8th and expanded to Syria in September. Operations have been joined by U.S. allies in the Middle East and Europe. On Tuesday and Wednesday, coalition forces carried out 18 airstrikes near the northern Syrian city of Ain al-Arab, also known as Kobani, and destroyed some Islamic State positions. Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said the airstrikes likely killed hundreds of the militants, but he cautioned that Islamic State could still seize control.
I think it's important for people to understand Kobani could still fall. It could very well still fall.
U.S. President Barack Obama on Wednesday spoke by video conference with 5 European leaders. They agreed that they need to do more to stop the influx of foreign fighters and funds to the Islamic State militants. They also agreed to enhance the military capability of Iraqi forces and moderate anti-government forces in Syria. Meanwhile, John Allen, the U.S. Special Envoy for the Coalition Against Islamic State Militants, spoke to reporters after visiting relevant countries such as Turkey and Iraq. Turkey shares borders with both Syria and Iraq and hosts Air Force Base at Incirlik, about 100 kilometers from the Syrian border. Allen says he and his Turkish counterparts are continuing talks on using the airbase in Turkey.
We had, I think, very detailed and very constructive conversations with the Turks.
A wave of daily airstrikes does not seem to have slowed Islamic State's momentum. Especially in Syria, the campaign may become a prolonged battle, due largely to the lack of ground troops fighting in coordination with the U.S.-led aerial campaign. Jun Yotsumoto, NHK World.
Well, the ongoing crisis in the Middle East and the outbreak of the Ebola virus are rattling financial markets across the globe. And Ron Madison joins us from the business desk. Ron.
Yeah, investors have a lot to consider with all this going on today. We've got renewed concerns about what's happening with the global economy, geopolitical risks, as well as what we just heard about what's going on with Ebola. So we did see the Nikkei average tumbling today to a 4.5-month low. For the details, we're going to go to the Tokyo Stock Exchange, where Maya Yoshida is standing by with the very latest. So, Maya, what can you tell us about today's trading session?
Well, it was a dramatic fall, and Ron, as you said, investors are facing a lot of risks, so this is definitely a time to play everything safe. Now, they were quite optimistic that the U.S. economy is immune to a slowdown in growth elsewhere, but that was until yesterday's weak U.S. data. So investors had to give up their bets based on a rosy outlook. Now, the Nikkei fell sharply right from the start and closed at 14,738, down 2.25%. And this is the lowest since end of May. And the broader topics closed below 1,200 for the first time since late May at 1,195. And an analyst says this was also due to massive selling to limit losses. Now, weak U.S. retail sales figures made investors risk-averse across the globe, and this led to buying on the yen and Japanese government bonds. And that pushed down the 10-year yield to as low as 0.47%, the lowest in a year and a half. Now, all sectors were down and a lot of stocks dropped to this year's lows, and I picked out some of them. In the financial sector, there's Nomura Holdings down 2.8%. In the real estate sector, there's Tokyu Fudosan down 3.9%. And the automaker Honda also dropped to this year's lows, and that's also due to the stronger yen. Now, Tokyo Electron actually announced pretty good earnings for the latest quarter, but looks like it couldn't resist the overall downward pressure, ending the day down 3.8%. Now, a big focus today was definitely on one of Japan's biggest IPOs. Staffing firm Recruit Holdings made its debut on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. It closed at 3,330 yen. That's about 200 yen